Hey, DeJesus here. Have you ever wondered if all of those custom painted shoes that you see online are actually wearable? Well, in this Back to Basics tutorial, I'll put that to the test. We'll walk through all of the essential steps needed to create your own pair, and then I'll personally wear mine daily for an entire month. Then we can finally answer the burning question. Is it possible to paint custom shoes that won't crack? Or is this outcome completely inevitable? First, let's take a look at some of the materials we'll need to paint our pair of Jordan 1s. For the prep work, we'll use various grits of sandpaper, Dura-Gold Scuff Pads, Angelus deglazer or acetone, and cotton rounds. As for the painting supplies, you will need an adhesion promoter, leather dye, Angelus leather paint, 2Soft, which is a medium for any fabrics, 4-coat finisher in whatever desired sheen you prefer, and a high quality brush set. Before we dive into the prep work, I just want to emphasize once again just how crucial this step truly is. Without it, all of the hard work and hours that you put into your project could be in vain if the paint cracks and chips as soon as you wear them. So I like to think of the durability of a pair of custom shoes almost like an iceberg. People often believe that finding some type of magical finisher will solve all of their problems, but in reality, it's the prep work and paint application that truly matter. In the past, there was an old adage that you only needed acetone to remove the factory finish, and then you could start painting. However, I found that just removing the factory finish isn't enough to ensure that our paint will stick properly. To achieve better adhesion, we'll start by sanding the surfaces with different grits of sandpaper. But here's a little technique that you might not have seen before. Pre-creasing the shoes so that we can see which areas we need to spend a little bit more time on during our prep work. Now remember, you should only prep surfaces that you plan to paint. So to begin, I'll rip a smaller piece of our 400 grit sandpaper, and I'm gonna start doing this in a smooth circular motion everywhere. I must admit that over time, I've definitely changed my approach, and now I highly recommend that you completely avoid going near the stitching during your sanding phase so that we can maintain a more factory-like appearance. Don't be surprised if you're ever working on white leather and there's any spots where you see some gray peeking underneath. That's totally normal, but it's not guaranteed to happen on every pair, so just something that you might want to take note of. Now let's move on to our 800 grit. Once that's done, there may still not be any huge differences between the prepped and unprepped shoe, but now we're ready for our last grit of sandpaper. This one is 1500. In smaller, tighter areas, you can fold your sandpaper up to still hit them while avoiding that stitching. Alright, after about 15 minutes or so, the sanding is complete on one of our shoes. I'm going to leave the other one completely unprepped just so we can do a before and after comparison, but now we're ready to grab one of our Dura-Gold Scuff Pads, and I'm going to cut this into a little bit of a smaller piece. Since we're working with deglazer or acetone, I highly recommend wearing a respirator or some type of face mask. The fumes can be quite strong, so make sure to protect yourself. So what we'll do is open up our deglazer. I'm gonna take our scuff pad, place it right on top, shake it just a little bit, and now we can start doing this in a circular motion on those panels. Once again, remember to avoid the stitching. Now during this phase, it's even more likely that you'll reveal some of that gray peeking beneath the leather. Here's another before and after comparison, and now we can go ahead and start removing any of that leftover residue from the sanding and scuffing phases with some of our cotton rounds and deglazer. Since we avoided the stitching during the earlier phases, really make sure to focus on those areas now. Alright, and here's a final before and after look at the shoes now that all of our prep work is finally complete. and now we're ready to move into the painting phase. In terms of design, I'll be taking these white cement Jordan 1s and transforming them into an Atmos Air Max 1 colorway. Now, typically the toe box should stay white if I were going true to the design, but we want to put these through a really rigorous stress test, so I'm going to go ahead and paint that black as well. For this step, I'll actually apply some leather dye to our toe box before painting it, and the working theory behind this concept is that if any paint were to crack or chip over time, the black dye will still be visible underneath, rather than the white leather that we currently have that would be much more noticeable if any of that paint were to crack or chip. But remember, none of this matters if you're painting a material that shouldn't be painted, such as rubber. The dye itself can still rub off in any of those areas, hence why it's generally best to avoid painting midsoles. When working with Angelus dye, it's extremely important to be careful with your surroundings, as it can easily stain any table or surface you're working on. Also, be sure to use a dedicated brush solely for the dye. Dip the brush lightly in the cup and wipe off any excess before applying onto the shoes. The dye spreads quickly, so you won't need much. Another great thing about working with the dye is that it's going to reduce the total amount of coats needed when we move into painting, since we're working on a darker surface now. Usually I'm not too concerned about paint cracking on the quarter panels, which are directly behind the swoosh, but since I already have the black dye out and started with the toe boxes, I'll apply some there as well. After that, I'll take some Q-tips, dip them in a little bit of the deglazer, and we're gonna rub this across all of the dye, and this is gonna really burn it into those panels. Now we're gonna do one more coat of the dye as well. All right, our next step is gonna be to apply some adhesion promoter to the shoes. Make sure you spray this stuff outside because the fumes can be quite strong. And the way that this Bulldog brand works is I'm gonna end up doing 2 light coats with it. Once I spray that first coat, I'm gonna let the shoes dry for about 5 to 10 minutes or so. And then I'm gonna spray my second coat, come back in and begin applying my paint directly on top of that. All right, we are finally ready to start painting these. You will notice a little bit of a sheen from the adhesion promoter itself, so that is normal. And finally, it is quite the process to get here, as you guys can see. Really nice thin layers is the way to go. Make sure to spread that paint all the way out. Now, it's very, very, very crucial that we allow plenty of time for the paint to fully dry on the shoes. Give it at least 20 to 30 minutes or so. While that black paint is drying, I'm gonna start prepping our clear jade color for all of the swooshes. I'll mix white, turquoise, and midnight green together following this approximate ratio. Since the swoosh is currently a black leather, it's wise to lay down a couple coats of light gray first. Otherwise, without this step, it would take far too many coats for this blue-greenish color to really appear vibrant. Using white paint as a primer isn't ideal either, since it's far too translucent, so light gray ends up being your best bet for something like this. Now we can proceed with another layer of the black paint. And I'm really just trying to take my time here, use a really nice flat brush so that we can get underneath those edges of the mudguard panel as well. Even though black is an easy color to paint and it looks really solid after just 2 coats, I'm still going to do at least a 3rd coat minimum. When we're ready to apply the clear jade color, I'll follow this type of paint buildup diagram. Different Angelus paint colors and surfaces may require varying amounts of coats. You may notice that certain materials or even specific colors may take longer to paint than others. The goal is to avoid applying too many coats up to the point that the shoes are no longer wearable. Following a chart like this can really help prevent that. As a general guideline, try not to exceed 5 to 6 light coats. So for the swoosh, I ended up doing 6 coats on the dot, 4 on the toe box, and now once all of the leather panels are done, I'm gonna go back with the tiny detail brush and touch up any of my unpainted edges. Next up, we'll paint the tongues black, and for materials like this and other fabrics, it's recommended that you mix some 2-Soft into your paint at a 1-to-1 ratio. Typically, airbrushing is preferred for really soft fabrics like sock liners, but in this case, painting the tongue will work just fine. Be careful not to get any paint on any unwanted areas, especially when you're painting behind the tongue. Time to heat set between coats of paint on the tongue. I'm gonna apply short bursts of heat, making sure not to hold the gun in any one spot for too long. After 3 coats on the tongue, everything looks good to go. If you plan on painting the tongue tags, it's important to mix some of the 2-Soft into your paint. Whether you're changing the color of the entire tongue tag or just painting the Nike Air branding, I still recommend painting the entire tongue tag first, even if it's the same color as it is now. This will help prevent bleeding when you go in to do that Nike Air branding, and it'll make color matching much easier. In this case, I'll start with a black coat on the tongue tag. Then I'll apply a coat of light gray similar to what we did on the swoosh. This will ensure that the clear jade color pops when we apply it. A toothpick really comes in handy for this step. When it comes to cleanup and touch-ups, really make sure to do your due diligence, give the shoes a very thorough final walkthrough, make sure you touched up all of your edges. If you have any dried up paint on the midsole, you can really easily scrape that right off with a toothpick, and really just try to make sure that the shoes are starting to look as factory as possible. Now that all the painting is complete, let's talk about some of the different options that you have here for finishers. As you can tell, there are plenty of great ones for you to choose from out on the market. I've even done some videos in the past that will really compare and contrast them, so I'll throw a card on the screen for you to check that out. I find that these finishers tend to work best when applied with an airbrush, and I know that many people have reached out to me in the past and said that they haven't had the best experience when trying to apply them with just a paintbrush, but that could be due to a multitude of factors such as how it was applied, or if the paint was actually dry when placing them on the shoe. In any case, make sure to really shake the finisher before using it, and then I'll load it directly into my airbrush. We'll apply 2 light coats of the finisher with sufficient dry time in between. It's also okay if some of the finisher gets on any of the unpainted panels as well. Once the finisher is applied, we need to wait at least 48 hours before wearing it. Alright, after very casually wearing these shoes for the last month or so, it is finally time to share the results with you guys, and I'm very pleased to say that everything still looks really, really good on these. All of the paint job is completely intact, and I think that that's probably due to some of those not so common practices that we do that you probably don't see in a lot of other tutorials, things that I had no idea about when I first started, such as pre-creasing the leather, dyeing the leather before painting it, sanding the leather, and using some of that adhesion promoter. I think those are the little things that go a really long way in making sure that you end up with a really long-lasting, durable product, which is what you're always going for, because there's nothing worse than putting a ton of time, effort, money into a project and all of a sudden it cracks or chips as soon as you wear it. That is just incredibly disheartening as an artist, and a lot of us have been there. So I'm very pleased to share these results with you guys. And something very interesting about these is even in some of those high crease areas, you can see we don't have any of that white leather peeking through. But on the insides of the shoes, there is a tiny little spot that I can see where the finisher is the first thing that failed. Or what could have happened is just with the casual wear, I probably bumped into something, maybe even rubbed the shoes together, and it appears that some of the finisher has rubbed off. But that's what it's there for, to provide some of that scratch protection. Since it is a urethane-based finisher, it essentially is going to give you an added layer of protection on top. Now, it's not going to prevent creasing or cracking if the paint's cracking underneath, but if the shoes were to just rub up against each other or something were to scratch your shoes, you'd rather it scratch off some of the finisher than any of the artwork. And all of the artwork, all of the paint job is still completely intact. So that is very, very promising to see. So I'm super pleased with how these turned out. And if you guys enjoyed this tutorial and maybe you're looking for some more hands-on training, you want to come see what it's like at the DCF Experience, our 3-day custom sneaker course, go ahead and check out this video next. All right, guys, everybody get out there and just create.